Well, hello, Faith Family, and thank you for joining us again for the Daily Connection. We're still in Romans chapter 8 under the title of No Doubt, Sure in Victory. And today we're looking specifically at verses 35 and 36, where Paul's continuing his pattern of asking a significant question and then pointing out the reality that in Christ, no, this can't possibly be. So look with me in verse 35. Who can separate us from the love of Christ? Can affliction or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword, as it is written, because of you we are being put to death all day long. We are counted as sheep to be slaughtered. So we're looking here in verse 35, and kind of like what he did in 34, where he says, who is the one who condemns? Paul comes back with another who question, but really the way that's constructed in the Greek is it really would be better suited to say, what can separate us from the love of Christ? And notice he says, love of Christ. Not, and by that he doesn't mean our love for Christ, but more importantly, Christ's love for us as demonstrated in salvation. So in an overall sense, what he's saying is, what can separate us from our salvation that's been sealed in Christ? And then he shares a couple of examples that in one sense are broad and general, but then there's some specifics that come out of that in verse 35. First of all, he says, can affliction. That word affliction, it's almost like a general term for hardship or difficulties endured. The word literally means to squeeze or apply pressure from the outside. And so it's almost like Paul starting with just this general broad statement of, can the hardships of life, can the things that we experience outside of us that put pressure on us, inwardly, emotionally, and psychologically, can these things separate us? Then maybe some specifics in terms of distress. Distress, it literally means to force into a narrow or small space, and it's the idea of being hemmed in, being confined. And so Paul is saying, hey, can the us being put into a restricted position? Secondly, can persecution, and that's really getting more into what would be familiar to the Christian life, because this is talking about hardship that experienced from the outside, unprompted by us necessarily, but brought on by the evil and the hatred of the world. And then kind of the outflow of that, this persecution may show up as famine, meaning that maybe perhaps somebody has their job has been taken from them, their ability for financial gain, meaning that now they can't provide the necessary nutrition, hence the idea of famine, inadequate nutrition. Secondly, nakedness. This isn't necessarily talking about nudity as we might understand it, the full exposure of the body, but it's really more talking about inadequate clothing. Clothing that might be torn and tattered, clothing that might be insufficient, clothing that might be inappropriate, meaning that it's not made out of the best fabrics, maybe like goat hair or sheepskin, things of that nature, which were kind of low tier materials of this particular day, because things had advanced in terms of the ability to develop certain types of clothing products, textile products. He says, or danger or sword. Danger and sword kind of can be linked together because both of them refer to the potential for death here. Can these separate us from the love of Christ? And it's amazing because he goes on to say, because of you, we're being put to death all day long. Paul sees in this the prophecies or the promises made in I believe it's Psalm chapter 44. I can't remember if it's verse 21 or verse 22. But there, Paul's quoting, it's verse 22. Paul's quoting from the psalmist saying that because of our faithfulness of God, we're like sheep led to the slaughter here. Because we're being faithful to God and we're living in an evil, fallen world. And it bears a strong resemblance to what we see in Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 36. There the writer says, others experienced mockings and scourgings as well as bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they died by the sword, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, mistreated. You see, here the writer of Hebrews is talking about those who have been faithful, how it's resulted in them, because we live in a fallen world, that it's dominated by evil in a sense. He says, hey, they experienced the hardships and the difficulties because of their faith. And yet in all of this, it's not that they lost their salvation or even could lose their salvation, but yet God showed himself to be faithful, and they remained faithful, awaiting the promise. And that's basically what Paul is saying here. He's saying, what can separate us from the promise of being sealed in Christ? And he says, nothing. Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ, because it's not our love for Christ, it's Christ's love for us, as shown in him saving our soul, both in his act of salvation, then in his gift of salvation. We are sealed in him for eternity. The writer asks this question: how can we be sure that God's love will never fail? Because it's an unfailing love. It's a love that's not based on merit. It's a love that's not based on accomplishments that we have done. It's based solely upon his supreme act of crucifixion, of resurrection, and then of extending that love to us in justification, sanctification, ultimately glorification. So regardless of our circumstances do not dictate our salvation. Our circumstances do not determine our salvation. Our salvation is sealed in Christ and in his love for us. And because of that, we know we're going to experience hardship in this life. Remember what Jesus told his disciples. In this life, you will have tribulation. You will have hardship. And he said, take heart, be of courage. I've overcome the world. And he's overcome the world through our salvation. And that salvation is now sealed in Christ, and nothing can separate us from that love. I pray this encourage you today, because you may be experiencing some of the distress and some of the various what means of persecution because of your faith right now in your workplace, at school, in your relationships, your recreations. Regardless of what's going on outside that's pressuring you, that's squeezing you, remember, your salvation is sealed in Christ. And you are more than a conqueror. You are more than conquerors. And we are more than conquerors in Christ who loved us. And for that, we shouldn't be distracted. We shouldn't be discouraged. We should be determined that we will live this life as those commissioned by Christ to live sent.